Stranger danger help you protect children from the abduction offender? Answer, perhaps. Will stranger danger help you protect children from the preferential offender? Answer, absolutely not. In fact, it will disserve you because it's going to continue to reinforce the idea that there is some visual profile to alert you to danger, the trench coat, the Beanie Babies. Right now, let's take that same question back into our what we're doing to protect children from sexual abuse. Remember the list I asked you to make? Okay, we've already talked about background checks. The next thing on that list that's generally the answer to the question of what do we do to protect children is your child check-in system. Okay, so let's follow that same line of questioning. Will your child check-in system protect children from the abduction offender? Answer, perhaps. Will your child check-in system help you protect children from the preferential offender? The answer, absolutely not. Okay, no offense to your child check-in system. See, it never was meant to. See, what we need to understand, now that we understand that there are two significant differences in what offenders exist, now we can go back to the original analysis of my fence. Because when I say our efforts are not related to the risk, what I have found over and over is we've built a beautiful barbed wire fence, understanding the risk is an abduction offender, while the preferential offender is destroying our ministries. Most of the things that I have found on Christendom's list is related to this risk, not this risk. So whatever we're doing to protect children from the abduction offender, we're doing a great job. How do I know that? Because we haven't lost a child in a long time. This fence is working as it relates to that risk. The better question I want to wake Christendom up to is, what fence do you have in place as it relates to the preferential offender? And since most of my ministry leaders have no idea what I'm talking about, they build this fence, they like this fence, and they go to sleep at night thinking the problem is solved. All right. Once we understand that there is such a thing as a preferential offender, now what I would want to do is come to my ministry leaders and ask the right question, which is, what are you doing at your church to protect children from the preferential offender? And generally that is a list that's not very complete. All right, so let's make a couple of other observations now that we're at this juncture. In other words, take this information and go varsity with it. When we get into some of the data about sexual abuse, now that we understand the difference between a preferential and an abduction offender, some of the information can now make sense in a context that we can use it. For example, we've often heard 90% of children are victimized by someone they know and trust. Well, why is that so? It's because it's the preferential offender. It's someone in that child's world that child is taught is trustworthy, is safe. So what we need to also understand is that the preferential offender is not the person driving an ice cream truck wearing a trench coat. The preferential offender looks like you and me. Now let's take that information and expand it for just a moment. Because see, some of the problem here is consistent with the way we live life and we don't give second thoughts to it. The second thought information I want us to have is, have you ever noticed that we do life with people who look like us? Now see, when my daughter was 6, I'm the one who chose what neighborhood we lived in, not her. Okay, I'm the one who chose what school she went to, not her. What church we went to, not her. So see, when my child is small, I'm the one who decides who the community is that we do life with. And I do life with people who are in many ways like me. So here's how this unfolds. See, if my child at 7 years old is victimized, in all likelihood, who will the abuser look like? The answer is, the abuser will look like me. And that sets us up for the varsity level problem of oftentimes the abuse will be difficult to believe about somebody difficult to suspect. Okay, so I just want you to know, you heard it here first, that be prepared for the fact that because we do life with people who look like us, that the allegation will be difficult to believe about someone difficult to suspect. All right, now, when we evaluate something like Jerry Sandusky, with the information we've already covered, a lot of this can make sense now. See, first of all, Jerry Sandusky would have passed your criminal background check. But see, there were allegations as early as 1999. Some of the information that's now being revealed is that Joe Paterno, for example, was told that Sandusky was dangerous to children in 1976, coaching staff in 1972. Okay, there were pings on the radar, but it was difficult to believe about somebody that was difficult to suspect, right? Now, in addition to that, you go into gymnastics. Larry Nassar, he had a past your criminal background check, but again, difficult to believe about someone difficult to suspect. And here's another very important concept that goes along with that is, you see, when somebody is educated, attractive, and articulate, it disarms us, okay? Take that into sport. When someone is educated, attractive, articulate, and necessary or important in that sport, it disarms us. In the church, when someone is educated, attractive, articulate, and spiritual leader, it disarms us. So what's sad about that, just getting into some of the way we live life, you see, in many ways we want to be disarmed. We want to rest. We want to know that there is some place I can go where I can just turn it off and my child is safe. Where are the top two places we go feeling like we're already safe? Home and church. Where are the primary places we're seeing children being victimized? Home and church. So we just need to understand, what does the risk look like? And then what do I do to ensure that this risk is addressed in the environments in which I have children that trust me for their care? Okay? So when we talk about difficult to believe, about difficult to suspect, and no visual profile, we need to understand we don't solve this risk. We don't reduce this risk with a visual profile. Because we can't recognize this risk visually, we need to recognize this risk behaviorally. That's the key. Because see, if you'd have understood the behaviors of the preferential offender, you would have recognized Jerry Sandusky as dangerous 45, 50 years ago. If you'd have understood the grooming process, the behaviors, you'd have recognized Larry Nassar as a problem 2 decades ago. So the big idea, we can't recognize this risk visually. We must understand the risk behavior. Let's go back to our fence, all right? The type of fence we build is driven by what we want to keep out. What we want to keep out is the grooming process, the behaviors. Once we understand the behaviors, now I can prepare the appropriate barriers to protect the children entrusted to my care. Knowing now that my visual profile is not helpful, also knowing that if I'm relying on that visual profile, that works to the offender's advantage, because what it does is it disarms me. I hold on to my criminal background check. I'm disarmed by the winsome appearance or presentation of that person, and I believe in my barbed wire fence, and my ministries are being impacted in a significantly negative way. All right? Now, oftentimes, because we rely on the media to inform us, what we need to also recognize is that the preferential offender can be male or female. Now, most of the media coverage we get relates to the male sexual offender, but the Department of Justice will tell us of the convicted sex offender population, 90% are men, 10% are women. Probably dazzle you with some legal information to suggest maybe it's 80-20, but what's the point? If you ask me straight up, Greg, isn't most of the problem men? I would tell you yes. But that is no reason to close your eyes to the other 10 to 20% of the risk. In other words, God doesn't give you 10 sheep and you choose your favorite 8. Okay? We need to understand what the risk looks like and takes the steps to address the risk. Oh, but see, on this one, when we talk about being disarmed, the female offender is even more significant to us, because you see, when we talk about when someone is educated, articulate, when someone is educated, articulate, and attractive, it disarms us. You see, when someone is educated, attractive, articulate, and female, it disarms us even faster. So we just need to understand the risk can come from the form of female. And again, the visual profile will disarm you even faster. But if we understand the behaviors, the grooming process of the female offender, now and only now will we understand what the risk looks like and can take steps to address the risk. Okay? No visual profile is an extremely important concept as it relates to the female offender. Now, the last risk, because remember, we're talking about risk because that's what drives our preparation of barriers. We need to understand there's a concept called peer-to-peer sexual abuse, okay? Or peer-on-peer. Now, That means child with child inappropriate sexual behavior. Now, just so you know, I'm not talking about the 17-year-old boy and his 15-year-old girlfriend. Okay? Definitionally, I could be, but I want to open your mind to the fact that it's oftentimes very small children engaged in very adult behavior. Okay? Now, this is consistent with what law enforcement tells us. There's been a 300% increase in the reports of peer-to-peer sexual abuse since 2008. Okay? Consistent with what work we do at our law firm. See, of the crisis calls that we get, I probably get an average of 3 to 4 calls a day. At least one of those calls will relate to peer-to-peer sexual abuse. And it's amazing how when people call, they always act as if they're the first person to ever have a problem with peer-to-peer sexual abuse. Like, no, it's the most common call I get. And in fact, law enforcement tells us it's a common call that they're getting and it's on the rise. Now, what's also important to note is average male molester, for example, begins victimizing at 13 and 14 years old. I mean, that's 7th and 8th grade. All right. Now, when we go back and talk about this risk, which is large and it's growing, and we evaluate the fence we have at present, watch that evaluation, how it should disturb us. Number one, will your background check solve this problem? Answer, no. Okay, what about your child check-in system? Answer is no. Okay, what about your 6-month member rule? Okay, trick question, what about your 2-adult rule? The reason why that's a trick question is, you see, it depends on what your 2 adults know. See, on my horseshoe-shaped facility, I had 2 adults and I had a peer-to-peer situation, but I had 2 adults who had no idea there was such a thing as a preferential offender or peer-to-peer sexual abuse. So the only supervision they could give me was related to the risk that they understood. In their bank of information, there was no offender, there was no offense other than the abduction offender, which is why, as it relates to the abduction of a child, those 2 gals were killing it. They were doing a great job. But as it relates to peer-to-peer sexual abuse, if it's inconceivable, in other words, if that's not even a risk you understand, you're not going to see it unfold. And the person on that playground that knew that was 6. All right? So 2-adult rule is one of the best ways to address this risk, but it starts with your 2 adults understanding that the risk exists, what it looks like, where it unfolds. So it's training is the key. So now I'm back at the back of the math book, telegraphing in advance, this is what I am looking for, but I wanted to make sure I'm making it clear, this is how we fail. Okay? It's the facts versus misconceptions.